Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. As I do in each episode of my podcast, I link and mention social media and audio platforms. So social media, I'm on X, Minds, and also it's a social form of media, but I also write on there. Substack. I write on Substack as a supplement to my podcast. So audio platforms, and of course my email, and all of those will be provided for you in this episode. Now, audio platforms on Audible, Amazon Music, Spotify for podcasters, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and I'm looking to grow to where you enjoy your podcast. I'm definitely on that. So this episode is the kickstart, so to speak, of folk music. I'm going to talk about its origin and everything else about that, and that's entitled with the origin of folk music. All right, let's start. Okay, the concept of folk music. The term folk music and its equivalents in other languages denote many different kinds of music. The meaning of the term varies according to the part of the world, social classes, and period of history. In determining whether a song or piece of music is folk music, most performers, participants, and enthusiasts would probably agree on certain criteria derived from patterns of transmissions, social functions, origins, and performance. Now, the central traditions of folk music are transmitted orally or orally. I believe the pronunciation of that. This is, they are learned through hearing rather than the reading of words or music, ordinarily in informal, small social networks of relatives or friends rather than in institutions such as schools or church. In the 20th century, transmissions through recordings and mass media began to replace much of the face-to-face learning. Now, in comparison with art music, which brings aesthetic enjoyment, and popular music, which often along with social dancing functions as entertainment, folk music is more often associated with other activities such as life cycle rituals, work, games, and folk religion. Folk music is also more likely to be a participant sort of mentality with the people who enjoy the music or fans or enthusiasts, rather than presentational, which is traditionally part of popular music and so forth. The concept applies to cultures in which there is also an urban, technically more sophisticated musical tradition maintained by and for a smaller social, economic, and intellectual elite in cities, courts, or urbanized cultures. Generally, folk music refers to music that a broad segment of the population, particularly the lower socioeconomic classes, understand, in which they identify. In this respect, it is the rural counterpart to urban popular music, although that music depends mainly on the mass media recordings, radio, television, and to some degree the internet for discursion. Traditionally, folk music performers were amateurs, and some folk songs, folk music, were literally known to all members of a community. But specialists, instrumentalists, and singers of narratives were important to folk art communities. In the 20th century, the role of professionals as performers and carriers of folk traditions expanded dramatically. Folk music, as it's believed to have existed in earlier times, may be discussed separately from periods of revival such as the 19th century European nationalism. In the 20th century revival shortly before and after World War II that were motivated by political agendas. In the context of popular music, performers of folk music may be distinguished by the use of songs with political agendas and the use of traditional instruments and acoustic guitars. On the other side of the musical spectrum, lines between folk music and art music were blurred beginning in the 19th century when art music composers introduced songs from folklore into urban musical cultures. This term for folk music in different cultures illuminated aspects of the concept. The English term and the French and Italian analogs, musique populaire and musica populaire, indicated that this is music associated with a social class, the folk. The German Volksmusik, people's music, combines the concept of class with the authentic group, as does the Hindi term Lokgit, I believe, the people's music in India. Czech, like some of the other Slavic languages, use the term nation and its relatives, indicating that folk music is the musical unifier of all Czechs. And it goes on to say, with the source that I'm using and I'm reading from, in Persia, the regional music in Persia is what folk music is known as. It emphasizes the distinct in folk music style and repertoire among different areas of Iran. The term folk music has also perhaps unwisely been used for traditional art music of Asia and African cultures to distinguish them from the Western classical system. Now, to wrap it up, and after I wrap it up, to let you know, this will be a continuation, and I'm gonna break everything down and talk about more and more in depth as the weeks go on about the origin and the classification and the genre and all that of folk music. So to wrap up, the typical 21st century concept of folk music comes from beliefs about the nature of music and musical life in the village cultures of Europe from the 18th and 19th century. But this traditional folk music culture was affected greatly by the rise of industrial society and of cities, as well as by national movements beginning in the 19th century. Both the threat to folk culture and the rise of nationalism spurred rival and preserving movements in which learned musicians, poets, and scholars provided leadership. In the 20th century, further revivals associated with folk music, with political and social movements, and it goes on to blur, that is, the musical distinction among folk, art, and popular music. Nevertheless, vigorous remnants of the traditional culture of folk music were retained in 19th century Western Europe and in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. These are the basis for the following characteristics. And the following characteristics, keep a lookout for that on Wednesday with part 2. All right, so this reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in. Definitely turn it all the way up. And, of course, take care. Bye-bye for now.